My name is Bektimir Ysmailov, and I'm an assistant professor of finance here at the Nazarbayev University Graduate School of Business. We are very happy that you could join us. Yeah, just to tell you a little bit about myself. So I have a PhD in finance and an undergraduate degree in finance from the United States. So corporate governance is kind of the area in which I do my research. I also teach corporate governance here at the Graduate School of Business. Kind of more broadly, my research interests lie in the area of corporate finance. So that is also one of the courses that I'll be teaching here at GSB. Thank you so much for joining. So the title of today's talk is Effective Corporate Governance. Today we'll answer 3 questions. So the first question is kind of what is corporate governance? The second question is how to design an effective corporate governance system in an organization. And finally, we'll talk about some of the firm value implications of effective corporate governance. So with that being said, let's begin our lecture. So I'd like to motivate the talk by saying that corporate fraud and corporate scandals have increased both in frequency and in scale in recent years. So there were at least 3 major corporate scandals around the world this year alone. So the first scandal involved Nikola company. So Nikola is an electric vehicle manufacturer, a US-based company. So it was accused of engaging in fraud. So specifically, the founder of the firm, Trevor Milton, was accused of making exaggerated claims about the technology that the firm had. He claimed that the company had some proprietary revolutionary technology that could completely revolutionize the electric vehicle industry. So he said that they'll beat Tesla, they'll beat the traditional car manufacturers such as Toyota, Audi, and many others. But it turned out that those statements were false. So the technology that he claimed that they had never existed. So the company, the stock price of the company essentially crashed. Now, the second case involves Luckin Coffee, a Chinese-based coffee chain. It went from a non-existent firm to a publicly traded firm essentially in 2 years, which is really quick. So on average, it takes 10 years for a firm to go public, but it took only 2 years Luckin Coffee. And so the key to their success is that they positioned themselves as a technology company rather than a coffee chain company. So they had very fast growth, so like 200%, 300%, and 400% growth year over year, which is just crazy. And so when people started looking into the firm, what they found out is that a lot of the growth and a lot of those sales, they were actually fake. So the chairman of the firm was making these sales to companies that were essentially his own companies. So they were faking those sales, and at the same time, they were making payments to fake suppliers, essentially taking the money out of the firm. So when that came to light, the company stock also crashed, and billions of dollars of value were lost. Now, the third case is a European company, the German company Wirecard. It was also accused. It is a financial technology company, so it was accused of also faking the sales. So they had partners in Singapore, in Philippines, and UAE that were supposed to be doing business on their behalf. But what people found out is that that business never existed. So when there was an audit, a special audit earlier this year, that from 2020 net profit that the firm reported in reality did not exist. And so the company went from a tech star to bankrupt. Now, Kazakhstan, unfortunately, is not an exception. So there have been major corporate scandals in this country as well. So I'm listing the 3 major corporate scandals, but there obviously were more. So the first involves the company called Eurasian Natural Resources Corporation. So it was a Kazakhstani company which was involved in natural resource business. It listed on the London Stock Exchange in mid-2000s. So it was very successful, growing really quickly. They acquired a bunch of assets in Africa. So the company came to a crash when the UK authorities accused the company of engaging in corruption. So they said that the company was paying off African politicians to acquire those very valuable assets. In Kazakhstan, there were allegations that the managers of the firm were selling the assets of the company at depressed prices to affiliated companies. So essentially embezzling the funds of the firm at the expense of shareholders. Now, the other two cases is Beta Bank, which the scandal that unfolded during the financial crisis, and most recently Tengri Bank, a bank that went bankrupt. So the news from a couple of weeks ago was that some of the top managers of the bank were involved in the embezzlement of funds. But those are allegations at this stage. Now, the question is, why that is happening and what can we do about it? And a lot of people argue that it's the failure of corporate governance to prevent those events from happening. So it was a complete and total failure in terms of corporate governance. So in this lecture, we'll cover kind of what is corporate governance and how to design an effective corporate governance system so we can prevent those events from happening. Now, before we define it, let's take a look at define two key concepts, agency relationships and conflicts of interest. So agency relationships, they arise when someone, an agent, acts on behalf of another person, the principal. So I'll give you an example. So for example, an employer and employee. So employee is an agent that acts on behalf of the employer, the principal. Or for example, a lawyer who is acting on behalf of the clients. So the client is the principal, the lawyer is the agent. So in the corporate world, we typically think of, so there are three major actors in corporate governance: the management of the firm, the shareholders of the firm, and the board of directors. So we think of managers being agents who act on behalf of the owners of the firm, the shareholders, and similarly, board of directors is also an agent that is acting on behalf of shareholders. Now, in the corporate world, the separation of ownership and control between the shareholders and the managers may result in a number of conflicts of interest between the managers and the shareholders. So specifically, I'll just give you one example is, for example, you hire a manager as a shareholder to act on your behalf, and you would expect to have him or her to have your best interest in mind. But in reality, what may be happening is that the well-being of the executive also depends on, let's say, some fun activities, some pleasure, going to spa salon, doing sports on the company hours and on the company money. So that would be an example of a conflict of interest where the executive is really concerned about his or her own well-being and happiness, which does not contribute to the value and the wealth of the shareholders. Now, if the managers, they always acted in the best interest of shareholders, then there would be no issue. And actually, corporate governance as a subject would probably not exist. But in reality, management does not always work in the best interest of the shareholders. So managers, as we said, may seek their own well-being and wealth at the expense of their shareholders. Now, this situation is referred to as an agency problem or the principal-agent problem, and it can arise in any agency relationship. Now, the costs that result from this problem are called the agency costs. And rather than focusing too much on the definition, let's take a look at a few examples. So what are some of the examples of agency costs? So the first one, as we mentioned, is where the managers, they dedicate insufficient time and effort on building shareholder value. They engage in some activities that don't contribute to the wealth of shareholders. The second example is inflated compensation or excessive perquisites. That would be, for example, so if you're overpaying the executive, that overpayment is coming from the pockets of the shareholders. And so that is an example of an agency cost, a direct cost. Another example is excessive perquisites. So the executive may want to use, a Rolls-Royce as opposed to, let's say, a Toyota. An executive may want to fly private as opposed to using business class. Or an executive might want to have beautiful furniture in the office, such as Herman Miller chairs, where he could use something much cheaper, but also functional. So those excessive perquisites are also an example of an agency cost. Why? Because the shareholders are bearing that cost. So some of the other examples is a failure to groom successors. So management is indispensable. So if you don't have anyone in your firm that can replace you, then you're essentially feeling irreplaceable, and that can lead to some misbehavior on the part of management, such as extracting excess compensation and excessive perquisites. And the final example is pursuing uneconomic acquisitions to grow the empire. So what people have documented is that oftentimes self-interested managers, they engage in these value-destroying acquisitions with the only goal of increasing the size of the firm. So why would they want to do that? Because size is directly correlated with the size of the firm is correlated with the size of the executive's compensation. So the higher the size of the firm, the higher the compensation, the higher the prestige, the higher the power. So managers have been found to engage in this self-interested behavior. Now, so what is corporate governance and what's kind of the goal of corporate governance? Now, the goal of corporate, so this to lessen agency costs, some type of control or monitoring system is put in place in the organization. And we call this system of checks and balances corporate governance. So the whole goal of corporate governance is to lessen these agency costs that arise between the shareholders of the firm and the managers of the firm. And so if we go to a few examples that I showed you on the first few slides, so the goal here would be to prevent those events from happening, to prevent billions of dollars of shareholder value lost, okay? And even corporate governance has been shown to enhance shareholder value because good and well-governed firms, they have been found to have lower cost of capital, and when you have a lower cost of capital, lower discount rate, the higher the value of the firm. Now, there are a lot of components that go into a corporate governance system. So one of the major components is the board of directors. So when we talk about the board of directors, think of them as being an intermediary between the managers of the firm and the shareholders of the firm. And so what people have found is that there are certain attributes of the board of directors that are correlated with good corporate governance. You can talk about composition in terms of independence. Do have independent directors on the board who can bring that independent opinions, independent oversight in the boardroom. Size, are large board sizes, are large boards efficient or small boards efficient? Chairman CEO separation. So we'll talk about all of these in detail later on. Another component is audit. So the board of directors typically has an audit committee on the board. Their primary goal is to make sure that the financial statements that the firm puts out on a quarterly or an annual basis, that those financial statements truly reflect the financial performance of the firm. Now, when you talk about the audit committee, you can talk about, do you have independent directors on that committee? Do you have financial experts on that committee who can truly understand the audit, the accounting, to be able to make sure that those numbers reflect the true performance of the firm? Another component is the charter and bylaw provisions. So every organization has a charter, and typically it has certain kind of the rights and the rights of shareholders. So some of them include the right to call special meetings. So we all know about the annual meetings and take place once a year, but do shareholders have the right to call special meetings? And what is required of shareholders? How easy is it for shareholders to call those special meetings? Another component is executive and director compensation. So that is also an important part of a corporate governance system. Here, the key thing is the so-called performance-based compensation. So the idea there is that you tie an executive's compensation to the performance of the firm's stock price or certain accounting measures, such as earnings per share or return on assets, but primarily the stock price. So the idea is that if you tie executives' compensation to those metrics, as the shareholder value increases, the compensation of the executive also increases. So moving on to the next component is some of the qualitative factors. You can talk about performance reviews, board performance reviews, individual director performance reviews. So you want to make sure if the board member is not performing up to the par, up to the level that you want that person to perform, that person can be dismissed. And finally, ownership, stock ownership by executives and directors. So the idea of this corporate governance attribute is to you essentially wanted directors and executives to think like shareholders. So you grant them stocks and you tell them to keep that stock, to not sell it during the service to the firm. So the idea is that if the managers and directors own the shares in the firm, they start thinking like shareholders as opposed to managers. And so you're essentially eliminating or minimizing the conflict of interest between the managers of the firm and the shareholders of the firm. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some of the key components of a corporate governance system that people typically talk about. But you know, one of the major, the critical part of the system of checks and balances that is corporate governance is the board of directors. So that really lies at the heart of a corporate governance system. Now, all countries, they require publicly listed companies to have such a board, okay? And their two fundamental responsibilities are to first, to advise the management and to oversee its activities. So in advisory function, their primary kind of job and responsibility is to make sure that the strategic direction that the managers choose is the right one, so they can challenge the managerial assumptions regarding the strategic direction of the company. But their second key responsibility is to kind of overseeing its activities and monitoring the behavior of managers. So the primary goal there is to evaluate the performance of an executive, and if the executive is not performing up to your expectations, to be able to dismiss that executive. And actually, in reality, that does not always happen. So oftentimes the board of directors is very hesitant to fire an executive despite poor performance. But you can think of the board of directors, like I mentioned before, think of them as an intermediary between the shareholders and the managers. Now, the attributes of the boards, they vary across nations. And it's important to realize that, you know, there are multiple attributes to the boards of directors, and some of these attributes have been found to be correlated with good corporate governance and high firm value. So some of the attributes include the structure, for example, the size of the boards, the independence of the boards, the stakeholder representation. So for example, boards in Germany, they require that companies have employees represented on the boards of directors. But for example, in the US, that is not a requirement. Or in Japan, they have bankers on the boards of directors. And there are many other features on the boards of directors. And you want to make sure that you get these attributes and the structure of the board right, because that will help you to build an effective corporate governance system and to prevent some of these bankruptcies and corporate scandals from happening. So, you know, because it's so important, like the structure and the attributes of the board of directors, so the countries, the regulators, and the stock exchanges around the world, they typically require the boards to have, you know, certain attributes, okay? So in Kazakhstan, some of these attributes are regulated by the Joint Stock Companies Act of 2003 and subsequent amendments. So we'll look at some of these requirements and attributes. So the three that we are going to focus on are, the first one concerns the outside directors. So this act says that except for the chair of the management board, no one from the management will be allowed on the board of directors. So when you think of the board of directors, there are two key types of directors, okay? There are independent, there are inside directors and there are outside directors. So inside directors are directors who are employees of the firm. So they're typically, those are the executives of the firm, such as the chief executive officer, chief operating officer, chief financial officer. So they are employed by the company, okay? And when they are represented on the board, then we call them inside directors. The second type is the outside directors. Outside directors are directors who are not employed by the firm. So for example, Tim Cook of Apple, CEO of Apple, he serves on the board of Nike. So from the perspective of Nike, Tim Cook would be an outside director because he is not employed as an employee of Nike, okay? Now, in regards to board independence, so who are independent directors? Independent directors are outside directors who, in addition, do not have a material relationship with the company. So for example, they could not have been employed by the firm in the past few years. They cannot be a consultant to the firm. They cannot be an auditor of the firm. They cannot be affiliated with a company that does substantial business with the firm. And so those are the independent directors. So the requirement is that at least 1/3 of the board members should be independent directors. So that's the requirement for Kazakhstani companies. And the final thing, major thing that we're going to look at is the chairman CEO separation. So in the board of directors, there is the chairman of the board, who is you can think of them as the general manager of the board of directors. And then you have the CEO, who is, we sometimes here we refer to them as the chair of the management board. So here it says that the chair of the management board, CEO or GM, cannot be appointed as the chairman of the board of directors, okay? Now, another important document in regards to corporate governance in Kazakhstan is the Corporate Governance Code of Samruk-Kazina. So with regards to board independence, the code says that the recommended share of independent directors on the board is up to 1/2 of the total number of the members on the board. Now let me give you kind of an example of a board of directors, okay? So that will help you kind of visualize and put those terms to actual practice. So Kazatomprom, one of my favorite local companies. So it's a major Kazakh company. It went public on the London Stock Exchange and the Astana International Exchange in 2018 in a highly successful IPO. So let's take a quick look at this board of directors. So here we have 3 independent directors. The first person, so that's Neil Longfellow, Russell Benham, and Mark Casher. So those are independent directors. They are not employed by the company, and they do not have a material relationship with the company. The next 3 directors, they are simply outside directors. They are not independent directors because they do have a material relationship with the company. So these people are Bibit Karamsakov, Almasadam Satkaliyev, and Kanat Kudaibergen. And finally, we have Galjan Pirmatov, who is the member of the board of directors, but who is also at the same time the chair of the management board. So that's so in America you would call him the chief executive officer of the firm, or the general manager. So he would be an inside director, right? Because he is directly employed by Kazatomprom. So he is not an outside director. He is not an independent director. And who do we have as the chairman of the board? We mentioned Neil Longfellow. He is the chairman of the board. So here we have 3 independent directors, 3 outside directors, 1 inside director, and you have the chairman CEO separation. So everything is in line with kind of the guidelines and the requirements of Kazakhstan. A quick cool fact is actually one of them is our NUGSB executive MBA graduate, Almasadam Satkaliyev. So that I found that to be pretty cool. So moving on with the presentation, let me pose a few questions. So I'm gonna ask the following questions. With regards to outside directors, should more insiders be allowed on the board? So for example, at Facebook, you have the Mark Zuckerberg, who is the CEO of the company, who is also, he is on the board of directors. But in addition to him, Sheryl Sandberg, a very famous chief operating officer of Facebook, she is also on the board of directors. So you have 2 insiders on the board of Facebook. So the question is, should we allow more insiders to be on the board of directors? With regards to board independence, so does board independence matter? Is 1/3 to up to 1/2 the right range for independent director representation? For example, in the US, major exchanges, they require at least a majority of independent directors. Should we adopt that? And the final question is chairman CEO separation. Should the roles be separated? For example, going back to Facebook, the CEO of the company, Mark Zuckerberg, is also the chairman of the board. So should the roles be separated, or should we allow one person to serve both as the chairman and the CEO of the company? So let me quickly talk about a little bit more about some of these key concepts, specifically in regards to outside independent directors. So let's discuss some of the potential benefits. So the potential benefit First of all, they're in a position to act without undue influence from the management of the firm. So what does that exactly mean? Let's compare them with inside directors who are employees of the firm. So let's say you start allowing not only the CEO of the company to serve on the board, but also the chief operating officer, chief financial officer to be on the board. Now, those people right below the CEO, they are typically hired by the CEO. So they have a direct reporting line to the CEO. They know that person, they know each other really well. They may be close friends. They probably see each other on a daily basis, and they have a certain level of allegiance to the CEO of the company. Compare that with an outside and independent director. So an outside independent director is not hired by the CEO. So it's appointed by the board, and they do not have a direct reporting line to the CEO of the company. So they can act without that undue influence from management in order to be able to challenge the manager's assumptions regarding the strategy, in order to be able to effectively evaluate the manager's performance, and if the manager is not performing, to dismiss the manager from the firm. Compared to, let's say, CFO or COO, who may be afraid to go against the wishes of the CEO. The second benefit is that they provide third-party advice and oversight. So these directors, they typically have a very successful experience in other companies. So they can bring really that knowledge, the best practices from some of the other firms into your own firm. So that's another kind of great benefit of having these outside and independent directors. But it's not all roses, okay? So there are some potential drawbacks. First, that they might be less informed about the company than insiders. So there may be this information gap. So for example, if you appoint me to the board of Kazatomprom right now, I don't know much about Kazatomprom. I don't know much about the nuclear sector, the uranium market. But compare me with some of the insiders in the company, they know everything in and out. They typically have been employed for a long time. So when discussing the strategy of the firm, they will be able to give better advice because they know the issues, the details that I, for example, may be missing as an outsider. The second drawback is that these outside directors might not behave with true independence. So there are typically regulatory checkpoints that we can check to satisfy those regulatory requirements. But in reality, these independent directors may be not that independent. And we'll look at some of the examples of that happening. They're also not always adequately qualified or engaged. We all know people who seem like they know their thing, but in reality they don't. So there's always this information asymmetry because you don't really know the outsider as well as the insider, because you can observe the performance of the insider on a daily basis. So that's another potential issue. And if, for example, an outside director is a CEO of another company, then if there are issues at that other company, the CEO may be too involved with his own company rather than paying attention to us. Now, in general, the research evidence is mixed as far as the impact of these outside independent directors on firm value. So we will highlight some of the both positive and negative aspects, okay? So let's look at some of the studies. So we'll look at studies, they will help us understand are some of these attributes good or bad, but there are two caveats that you should keep in mind when discussing these studies. First of all, they're based on large samples and they report averages. So even if the study says on average one thing is good, that does not mean that that thing will be good in your own organization. So that's important to keep in mind. And the second issue is the so-called indigeneity issue. And in one sentence, it would be correlation does not always imply causation. So for example, in regards to the independent directors, so what has been happening is that firms that are not performing really well, they always want to change something, right? In terms of corporate governance. And oftentimes what they have been doing is that as performance goes down, they start appointing independent directors to the board to bring that third party oversight and advice so that the performance of the company can go up again. But the issue as a researcher, when you see that, you may conclude that there is a relationship between bad performance and independent directors. You just look at them, you see poorly performing firms, they have independent boards. you may conclude that independence is bad. But in reality, what is actually happening is that it is the performance, the poor performance, that is causing board independence. So it's important to realize that there is this potential issue of indigeneity where you don't know which direction the causality is going. But there are ways to address that. And we'll look at some of the studies that have done somewhat of a good job of addressing that. So the first study we'll look at is by Nguyen and Nielsen, 2010. They studied the stock market reaction to the sudden death of an independent director. So the question is, why are we looking at such an unfortunate event, right, to study the value of independent directors? And the answer, the short answer is that here we are trying to get away from this indigeneity problem. So we are assuming that good performing firms and bad performing firms are just as likely to be subject to this unfortunate event. So we can evaluate the value of independent directors regardless of the firm performance. So we're trying to get around this indigeneity problem. So these two researchers, they have a sample of 229 deaths from 1994 to 2007, and they find that shareholders react negatively to the sudden death of an independent director. So the reaction is more negative when the director serves a key role, such as the chairman of the board serving on the audit committee, which is the most important committee, or having a tie-breaking vote on the board. Now the reaction is less negative when the director has been on the board for a long time. So the idea there is that over a long enough time, the manager will become close friends with an independent director, and the independent judgment of the director will be compromised by this cozy relationship with the manager of the firm. And so what is the big takeaway and conclusion of the study is that shareholders react negatively to the loss of independent directors. So in other words, shareholders value independent directors, independent oversight, and third-party advice. So the next study we'll look at is by Duchin, Masusaka, and Osbas, 2010. So they examine whether the effectiveness of outside directors is influenced by how difficult it is for outsiders to acquire expertise about the company. So this kind of goes to the idea of the information gap, where insiders know more about the firm and they can have a better input into the strategic direction of the company, as opposed to outsiders who don't know much about the firm. So they have a sample of 2,897 companies from 2000 to 2005. They measured the cost of acquiring information by the number of analysts following the firm. So the idea is that the greater the number of analysts, the easier it is to acquire the information about the firm. So for example, I know a lot more about Apple, which is followed by a lot of analysts, than I know about Kazatomprom. So the dispersion of estimates, so these analysts, they typically make estimates, let's say for earnings per share, quarterly earnings per share. So if the estimates are very dispersed, then that may mean that it is difficult to acquire information about the company. It's difficult to come to an agreement what that EPS will be next quarter. And the final measure, they look at mean forecast error. So once the company reports the earnings, how accurate were the analyst estimates? If they were on average right, then that means maybe the cost of acquiring information about the company is relatively low. So the authors find that if the cost of acquiring information is low, the performance increases when outside directors are added to the board. So they measure performance using two measures, Tobin's Q, or the market to book ratio, and the return on assets. And on the other hand, you have, if the cost is high, performance deteriorates. So it's important for us here to realize that this information gap does have an impact on kind of the performance, on the performance value of independent directors. So depending on what kind of organization you have, if it's a relatively straightforward organization, the value of independent directors for you may be higher. So the next study by Knyazeva, and Masulis, 2013, they examined the relation between independent directors and performance. So they have a sample of 900 small and mid-sized firms in the S&P 1500 index. So they also go around this indigeneity problem. So that's one of their main contributions. So what they do is they proxy for the independence of the boards by the availability of local directed talent. So for example, they say, so instead of kind of looking at the appointments of independent directors, which may be influenced by the performance of the firm, we want a measure of independence that is unrelated to performance. So they say that measure is the local direct labor market. So for example, in Astana, in Nur Sultan, we have a lot of, let's assume we have a lot of potential directors compared to, let's say, Karaganda. So these authors would say that the independence of companies that are headquartered in Astana will be higher compared to, let's say, Karaganda. And so what they do, so once they proxy for independence using this measure, they find that independent directors are positively associated with firm value and operating performance. And so the conclusion is that independent directors, they improve performance. So then this next study, so we'll take a look at two more studies relating to independence, specifically monitoring function. So Coles, Daniel, and Naveen, they studied whether outside directors appointed during the CEO's tenure, whether they behave independently. So they have a sample of S&P 1500 companies from 96 to 2010. They measured the percentage of the board that's appointed during the CEO's tenure. So the assumption is that these directors will have allegiance to the CEO for helping to attain those board seats and therefore are co-opted. So the idea is that, so in reality, CEOs don't have like a decisive say in whether the particular director is hired or not, but nevertheless, they do provide input, right? Because you want to make sure that CEO has good working relationship with those people. And so these authors assume that if the director is appointed during the CEO's tenure, that director may feel kind of allegiance and loyalty to that CEO and may not act independently. So what these authors find is that the board co-option is positively associated with CEO pay levels. So we typically in corporate governance think of that as not being a great thing because that may suggest overpayment, and that overpayment is coming out of the pockets of shareholders. It's negatively associated with turnover performance sensitivity. So what does that mean? That means that the board is not dismissing underperforming CEOs. So if the board is co-opted. And so the conclusion of the study is that outside directors that are kind of beholden or loyal to the CEO, they might not be independent. And the final study relating to board independence is by Fogel, Meyer, and Morg. They examine whether powerful directors act independently. So they have a sample of around 19,000 unique directors from 1998 to 2010. So the powerful directors are defined as having large professional networks. So the idea here is that if a director has a large professional network, that may imply that the director is highly successful, knows a lot of people, has access to information, has access to opportunities. So that director may not be as concerned about, for example, being in disagreement with the managers and potentially, leaving the board if he has to. And so what do they find is they find that powerful independent directors are associated with more valuable mergers and acquisitions. So typically mergers and acquisitions are value destroying, but here they show that powerful independent directors are associated with more valuable M&A. There is a more stringent oversight of CEO performance. So if CEO is not performing well, the board is more likely to fire that executive if it has powerful independent directors on the board. And there is less earnings management. So earnings management to a certain degree is good, like it can be good because you don't, so there are you can take advantage of certain tax issues within like legal limits, but too much earnings management is a bad thing. And finally, they find that the shareholders react negatively to the sudden death of powerful independent directors. So here, once again, they're trying to go around this indigeneity issue by looking at this unfortunate event that can happen in both well-performing and bad-performing firms. So the conclusion is that powerful directors exhibit greater independence. So I hope some of these studies show is that really this kind of the attributes of the board and the independence and outside directorships, they're not always a good thing, but they can be a good thing in certain scenarios and in certain circumstances. Now, what have we done so far? So far we've discussed independent directors and outside directors. We kind of looked at the main ideas, the potential advantages and drawbacks, right? So the second thing we did is we look at research evidence. So the research evidence can also serve a useful purpose to give you like a broader idea about it will expand your information set for you to make better decisions. Now, the final guiding post is in regards to this, to corporate governance attributes and features, is the global best practice. So let's look at some of the board independent standards by region. If you recall, in Kazakhstan, the regulations require from 1/3 to recommended up to 1/2 board independence. So for example, in Europe, some countries suggest or require companies to have a majority independent boards. So those are mostly Scandinavian countries. As far as the 1/3 number, kind of to compare to Kazakhstan, European countries such as Russia and Italy have that recommendation. In terms of Asia Pacific, the major markets of Singapore and Hong Kong, they require 1/3 in line with Kazakhstan. In the Americas, 1/3 is for Brazil, and the United States and Canada, they require the majority of independent directors on the board. And finally, the Middle East and Africa, so the markets of UAE and Turkey, they recommend at least 1/3, so in line with the requirements of Kazakhstan. And two other kind of reference points as far as the global best practice, NYSE, as we mentioned, the listed companies board is required to have at least 1/2 of independent directors, and CFA Institute these days recommends that more than 3/4 of the board should be independent. So are these the truths? They are not. But it's important to kind of know them so that they provide a good reference point for us. All right, so let's move on to the next corporate governance feature, which is the chairman-CEO separation. So as we mentioned, the chairman of the management board in Kazakhstan cannot be appointed as the chairman of the board of directors. And with the question that I posed is, should the roles be separated? Now, let's also discuss the key concepts, okay? So what are some of the potential benefits and costs? So in theory, having a separate or independent chair improves the ability of the board of directors to oversee the management. So let's be more specific. So what are some of the potential benefits? So the most important benefit is the clear distinguishment of the roles of the board and the management. So remember I said that the board of directors is kind of an intermediary between the managers and the shareholders. And it's important to realize that the board is not an extension of management. So it has its own responsibilities and goals. So the goals of the board is to advise the management and to oversee the management. Now, if you have the same person serving as the chairman of the board and as the CEO, then the roles are not really clearly defined. So you're essentially giving one person the right to essentially evaluate his or her own performance and have too much input on whether to hire or fire himself or herself. So in terms of performance evaluation, there is really a big issue if you have the same person serving as the chairman of the board and the manager of the firm. Also, in terms of executive compensation, you're essentially giving the say to the manager of the firm to be also deciding on his or her own salary. And the other potential benefit of having separate people serving as chairman of the board and CEO of the company is that CEO can focus completely on the strategy, operations, and organizational issues of the firm. So this focus is important. You're really not concerned about these other responsibilities in terms of recruitment of new directors, performance evaluation, or compensation, and things of that nature. But the separation of the chairman and CEO at the same time also has certain potential disadvantages. So what are those disadvantages? First of all, it can be an artificial separation, particularly when an effective chairman and CEO is already in place. So to give you an example, I think this was the case at Tesla. So Elon Musk, until recently, used to serve as both the chairman of the board and the CEO of the company, but then he sent some tweets regarding some funding from Saudi Arabia to take the company private, and the SEC didn't like it, and they required Tesla to separate those roles. Well, they eventually did separate them, so Elon Musk does not serve as the chairman of the board right now, but in reality, I do think that he still has just the same amount of power. So it is an artificial separation, at least it can be in certain firms. It also duplicates leadership. So it can lead to less efficient decision-making and internal confusion. This is kind of one of the key reasons, the key potential disadvantage. So for example, if the manager wants to take, the CEO wants to take the company in one direction and the board, the chairman of the board wants the company to go in a different direction. So if you're, let's say, CFO or COO of the firm, you're asking yourself, who do I listen to? Do I listen to the CEO or do I listen to the chairman of the board? Because the chairman of the board and the board of directors has the ability to fire the CEO, so they do have a lot of power. But at the same time, the CEO is the CEO. He is the one who hired me. What should I do, right? So that can lead to confusion and less efficient decision making. So the most research evidence, it finds no evidence that independent status impacts outcomes on average. And the keyword here, as throughout this presentation, is the word on average. So as we mentioned, that does not mean something is going to work or is not going to work in your firm. So let's take a look at one study by Krause and Simadeni in 2013. They evaluate the impact of separation, chairman-CEO separation under different scenarios. They have a sample of around 1,000 companies from 2000 to 2006. They go around this indigeneity issue by exploiting regulations in the US. There were a lot of new laws and requirements by the exchanges in the early 2000s following certain corporate scandals. So what do they find? They find that this separation has positive effects following weak performance and a negative effect following strong performance. So what does that mean? So that means that if the company is performing well and it has dual chairman and CEO, let it go, let it go. Don't break those roles apart only for the sake of improving corporate governance. So if the performance is good and you have dual chairman CEO, let it be, and don't mess with something that works, right? But on the other hand, separation has negative effect following has positive effect following weak performance. So on the other hand, if the performance of the firm is going down, then if you want to make a change, bring that third-party advice and oversight, then you may want to separate the roles, okay? So essentially, you want to bring that experience, and hopefully that will lead to good performance, and the authors do find that does lead to good performance. So the conclusion is that this impact of separation depends on the setting, and so the authors say that the relevant question is not whether the roles should be separated, but rather when and how a firm should choose to separate them. Now, so once again, what we did is we looked at some of the common sense arguments for and against chairman-CEO separation. We looked at research evidence, and now let's look at the global best practice. So in 2005, 30% of chairman and CEO roles at companies in the S&P 500 were split. But in 2018, that number has grown to 53%. So why did it grow? Well, there was a push by these governance experts and governance practitioners that separation is a good corporate governance practice. So there were a bunch of shareholder proposals in the US to separate those roles. So some firms adopted those proposals, and you ended up having a substantial increase in this chairman and CEO roles being separated. Now, the second global best practice I want to talk about is by the Norges Bank Investment Management. So this company is kind of a firm that's affiliated with the Central Bank of Norway and with the Ministry of Finance of Norway. So these are the people that manage the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Norway. So the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Norway, as you know, is the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. They have more than $1 trillion in assets. So my understanding is that Samruk kind of wants to model itself after them. So right now, my understanding is that Samruk is operating mostly like a conglomerate company, being too involved in the operations of its portfolio companies. But what they want to do is move on to this, investment management company. So to have a portfolio on a much more passive basis and diversify to different geographies. So I thought it would be interesting to look at what do they say, right? So what do they say? So they say that we believe that a clear division of roles and responsibilities is necessary to ensure effective oversight and controls, And this may be particularly relevant for monitoring management performance and deciding on remuneration of the CEO and management, or the salary of the CEO and management. So they speak directly to some of those advantages in terms of clearly distinguished roles, in that you want the board to serve as a check on managerial behavior, and the board may not be able to accomplish that if the same person is acting both as the manager and the chairman of the board of directors. Now, the big question is, are there best practices in corporate governance? So to answer that, let's look at 3 pairs of companies. So the first pair of companies that I want to look at is Nikola company that we discussed on the first slide, and Apple. So both firms are listed in the US, and according to the US listing exchange requirements, both firms have independent boards. And yet one of these firms was engaged in major corporate scandal and its stock price crashed, and the other company has excellent corporate governance, one of the world's most admired companies in terms of, governance, sustainability, environment, social responsibility, and all those things. The next pair of companies is Luckin Coffee and Starbucks. So Luckin Coffee, as we discussed on the first slide, was engaged in corporate fraud, faking sales. And on the other hand, you have Starbucks, which is considered to be excellent in terms of its governance, sustainability, environment, workplace practices, and all those things. And yet what unites these companies, Luckin Coffee and Starbucks, their competitors, is that they were also both listed in the US. So Luckin Coffee was eventually delisted, but prior to the scandal, it was listed on NASDAQ. And so both companies had independent boards, more than 50% independence. The final pair of companies is Enron and Walt Disney. So Enron, we haven't discussed it, but it was involved in one of the biggest scandals in the corporate scandals in the US in early 2000s. It was also kind of faking revenue, hiding liabilities, and all those things. And on the other hand, we have Walt Disney. Walt Disney is one of the world's most admired companies that is considered to have excellent corporate governance. Now, what unites these two companies is that they both traditionally had dual chairman CEO roles. So at Enron, both at Enron and Walt Disney, we traditionally have dual chairman and CEOs. And so how do I answer this question? Are there best practices in governance? And more broadly, how do I answer those 3 questions that I posed, right? With regards to outside directors, independent directors, and dual chairman CEO roles. There is really no answer. So I won't be able to provide an answer because there are no right answers in corporate governance. So it really depends on your own situation, on your own organization. But what we are trying to give here is the full set of information that you can use to make better decisions. Now, as a bonus, I wanted to cover just one more research study relating to board composition. So as I mentioned, there are certain attributes of the board that are correlated with good corporate governance and good performance. So let's look at some of the international directors. So some of the major Kazakhstani companies, especially in the portfolio of Samruk, they have a bunch of international directors on their boards. And so the question is, are those international and foreign directors, are those valuable? Because, local people, the general public may be suspicious of having foreigners on the boards of local companies. And so the question is, should we allow that? Should we have that? Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? So one study that kind of looked at this in a very robust way is Giannetti, Lau, and Yu, 2015. So they studied the impact of directors with foreign experience on firm performance in emerging markets. Specifically, they look at China, but that is also applicable to the emerging economy of Kazakhstan. So they have a sample of around 1,700 Chinese public companies from 1999 to 2009. And so what they say is that, what they find is that when individuals with foreign experience join a firm's board, the valuation increases, the profitability increases. Also, the propensity to manage earnings decreases. So there is less trickery on behalf of managers. There is also more international M&A. So the investment set of the company expands to include other markets. They're also better able to attract foreign investors, and they have an increase in exports. So the authors of this study conclude that directors do transmit knowledge about management practices in corporate governance to firms in emerging markets. I thought this is quite relevant to the companies of Kazakhstan, to the major companies of Kazakhstan. Now, to conclude, I want to say two things. So first of all, there is no single system of governance that is appropriate for all companies in all industries worldwide. So as we mentioned, so the whole, I hope the main takeaway of this talk is that you really have to consider the situation of your own firm and to have this full set of information to make good decisions, because it will really vary depending on your industry, depending on your own firm, depending on the economy, all of those things, depending on the country and culture. All of those things play a role in whether certain governance feature or attribute will be valuable for a firm or will be useless. But what should be our guiding principles? Our guiding principles should be common sense. So we should understand what are kind of the main reasons behind this or that particular governance feature. We should understand the research. You want to know what does the research say. And the final thing is you have to realize what is the global best practice. If there are certain things that work in other markets, maybe they will work in our market as well. So with that being said, thank you so much for joining this talk. It was great to have you here. I think we'll open it up to questions, but so hopefully you'll join us here at NUGSB. We'll be very to have you here in one of our programs, whether it's Executive MBA, Masters in Finance. We have MBA programs. So we hope that you do join us sometime in the future. Thank you so much.